Yeah, good morning to all. I will start the second chapter. This is on policies and legal aspects of the environment. So let us try to understand what are the kinds of norms that prevail in our country and also international norms. So now first let us try to understand why the legislations are required in any region. So can anyone answer that? Why legislations are required?
They are like the binding factors. Otherwise, like it's like once any legislation is passed, so then the people need to adhere to that. If they are not adhering to that, there can be some like consequences of it, may be penalty or imprisonment, something like that. So if you don't enforce such things, the people will not care about. And on the other hand, on the positive side, the people will understand. So what are the legal requirement, because it will be designed by very well-known and expertise in those areas, so that it will make sure, like for example, if I take anything with respect to environment, it may be a consent. So the people will work on that and expertise will design, and they say this needs to be like complied. Otherwise, there will be nobody to ask what's being done. So if just for example, if I say if the traffic police on the way asks, like show these document, that document, so if he doesn't quote that, if I ask him like where is it written, so why should I produce a document to you, so then he can quote the legislation.
Okay, that is a good example. In fact, we are equipping the regulatory authorities if the legislations are there in place. That means the traffic police could take action on the violators provided the norms are there. That is where, why the norms are created, why the legislations are created. That is for the benefit of the society to maintain the integrity of the system. Whether when we talk about traffic, if you look at if there are violations of traffic, naturally there will be a problem for the co-users of that road. So that's where, and also if the driving license, if it is not there, see, I've seen in Bangalore the youngsters using the two-wheelers or a car, which leads to the accident. The youngsters less than 18 years. Naturally, when police catches them, then these youngsters pose a question to the police saying that on what ground they question. That is where norms help. Norms are the guidelines for the people to manage the system. That's where when it comes to the environmental norms, we have the norms so that we can minimize the violations. If you look at why the violations happens in the system, it is because of the greedy people. For example, in Bangalore, people encroach the lake. The people encroach the buffer zone. When we question that, the first thing they say that no, there is no rule on the buffer zone. When we cite that rule, then they try to this one, and of course, then also we have to go to the legal thing. And probably in the entire country, the Bangalore is a city where we have been successful in removing some of the encroachment. Belandur Lake, there were about 14 to 15 acres of land was the encroached. When we mapped it and gave it to the National Green Tribunal, then based on the NGT, the ruling, the city administration removed those encroachments. So that is where, if the norms are there, it also helps in maintaining the integrity of the system, whether it is a land or water, etc. Okay. Now, let's move further. So, see, you all would have seen their website. Yesterday, I had asked you to go through the website. There's a section on rules and regulations. I'm sure most of you would have gone through that and you would have written the assignment. Please send that assignment to me at my email ID, which through which I am corresponding. Okay. So, and when you look at the norms, there are norms related to the land, related to the water, related to the environment, and also related to the society. For example, the rights of the tribal people is also there. Is a Forest Dwellers Act is also there. So now when you look at the water or the air, the purpose of this, the norm is to maintain the integrity of the water body. Why the water quality has to be maintained or the integrity of the water body has to be maintained? So that, when the quality is maintained, everyone's health is taken care of. People who dependent on the water body get listen. When the water quality is deteriorated, then you see that the entire section of society gets polluted, get affected because of the pollution. So it could be in the form of diseases, or it could be in the form of other problems also. Now if you look at the Water Act of 1974, it talks about, it prohibits the discharge of pollutants into the water body beyond a given standard. Before majority of took birth on this land, there was a norm. But even then, we have allowed the industries to pollute the water body. Then we come up with a package saying that Ganga rejuvenation plan, 10,000 crore for the next 5 years or 20,000 crore. It has become a kind of a milking cow for the politician and administrators through that kind of a rejuvenation program. Had we implemented this norm, had we implemented this legislation effectively, then the water body wouldn't have got polluted. The cost of polluting and subsequent rejuvenation is much higher than the industry setting up the treatment plant. When we talk about treatment plants at the industries, first and foremost thing the industries come up with the theory is that they are helping the nation in improving the GDP, and the installing the treatment plant would cost more. So that is where, they also, gang up with the politician and the pollution control board officials, and that's where they take part in the polluting the water body. If you look at from 1970 onwards, there has been a very, the progressive laws have come in the country, probably in the entire globe. Indian laws are more effective and powerful had they been implemented. The lack of implementation is the root cause of environmental degradation in the country, and lack of implementation is mainly because many people in our system do not take part in the decision making. They do not question if the water body is getting contaminated, or if the common land, like a grazing land or the Gomala, is being the encroached, or even the any other forestry is being abused by the influential sections of society. Because of the non-participation of the 80% of the population, the remaining 20% of the people have become vocal. They abuse the environment. They are, which is leading to the degradation of the ecosystem. Okay. Then if you look at the Air Act, of course, Air Act, see, as far as the common man is concerned, he is addressing the thing. See, because when we take the vehicle, if you don't have emission test, you may have to pay 500 rupees to the penalty. But had they, if you look at the industries, when there are no the complaints of the act, it only helps the regulatory agencies to make money. That is where if the local people understand the legislation, they can question the regulatory agencies, then no one can they pollute the system. No, the regulatory agency official will have the courage to accept the bribe and allow the pollution. So that is where awakened society is a requirement of today. Awakened society and taking part in decision making, questioning the decision making would ensure the integrity of the ecosystem or the integrity of the environment. In our country, if you look at, people raise unnecessary the issue, but had they taken up this kind of issue, we would have ensured the cleaner environment for our children. But instead of that, we take up other issues which are not relevant, and we become emotional with those things. So, and I think the country is facing a serious crisis today because of this, the half knowledge people. They wouldn't know the concept, but they become the master of the concept. So now when you look at the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, we identified certain taxa and we call them, they are the endangered and endemic species, etc. we said that, okay, Schedule 1 species, if they are there, then no the violation of their habitat, etc. Then the another thing is the Forest Act 1980. I have seen that the Forest Department by and large is quite active in implementing the Forest Act, unless there are some corrupt fellows. But in Karnataka, I have seen by and large this act is implemented. Only in one or two division in a year, I see some violation. That is mainly because of the lack of integrity of the individuals concerned at the local level. But by and large, that act is being implemented by the officials of the forest department. That's where, the politician hate the forest officers, because the forest officers, sometimes the sincere officers, are very ruthless in maintaining the integrity of the ecosystem and the forest. Okay. Then another act of 1986, which forms the umbrella legislation. That means based on the Air Act, Water Act, and all those things. So they came up with the Environmental Protection Act of 1986. It encompasses all the things, and it forms the basis for most of the subsequent legislation, whether it's an environmentally sensitive zone, etc. Okay. So now, as far as this chapter is concerned, that is as far as the assignment I have highlighted. So when you people worked on the assignment, we also did the job here. Okay. As far as the today's chapter is concerned, I'll introduce you to the environmental policy. So I will highlight the linkages, the economics and environmental policy, industries and environmental policy, agriculture and environmental policy, then ecosystem conservation, then what are the environmental policy instruments, these laws and legislations in the country. So then we will take up the policies and programs in India, what are the forest conservation activities, NGO movements for environmental protection in India. So then we'll look at the laws and legislation, the principles of international environmental law, then which are the institutions that are there globally talking about conservation. Then we also look at the key environmental treaties. See, we have the global treaties, the countries would have ratified the treaties. There is no binding on the respective country that it has to be implemented. By and large, all the countries try to they follow the norms once they sign the agreement. Whether it's a Kyoto Protocol or the any other the biological diversity, the conservation. So when the country signed those and ratified that treaty, we also brought the legislation in our country to implement those norms which were they formulated at the international level. If you look at Biodiversity Act of 2002 is a good example of our action following the international treaties. Okay. Then objectives and the principles of environmental legislation we can see. Then what are the legislation in India that I have highlighted just now? Some more are there. Maybe we will discuss it. And also we will see that, our elders have done a wonderful job. Especially the people like Ambedkar, the way they had visualized these things. So way back in 1900, and have come up with the legislation is a remarkable thing. Of course, the current generation, we are at the diluting those norms, and also if the time permits, they might even remove this legislation. So that's where when people get awakened, no one can violate the norm. See, that is where environmental awareness is a key weapon in our day-to-day life, so that we can maintain the integrity of the ecosystem. Okay. Now, the objectives of this chapter is to discuss the evolution of environmental policies. You all know the environmental policies. There are various terminologies people would have used: the laws, bill, and legislation. When you draft the norms and when you discuss it at a preliminary level, we call that as a bill. When it is ratified at the assembly or in the parliament, it becomes a legislation of the region or the country or the state. Okay, that's how the legislation takes into shape. But if you look at the recent legislation, whether it is the EIA, now EIA amendments are happening, that they have come out with a draft amendment which they had put it on the internet for the public opinion. by and large, most of the people have, the people who work in the domain have responded to the thing. Now there's a discussion happening at the standing committee level, the parliamentary standing committee. Once the parliamentary standing committee do the scrutiny of the thing and take into account the suggestions of the public, then it comes to the parliament, and of course there will be a discussion in the parliament. That is where selecting the right people to the parliament is also on the lies on the shoulders of all of us. See, when we allow the corrupt politician, just because they give us the pressure cooker or the television, if you vote to the corrupt fellows, then of course they will ruin the country. That is where now, as far as the country is concerned, by and large, 50 to 60% in the country are literate. If the literate section of the society wake up and then choose the right person, probably we can have a better governance in the country. See, but unfortunately, the 60% of the population who are semi-literate do not take part in the selection of the right people. They do not go and vote on that day. In the process, then of course they will spend time criticizing the system. For the mistake of them, we are paying the price. So that is where we need to understand our responsibilities and what are the norms that are there in the country. Voting should have been the mandatory in our country. Unfortunately, if you make it mandatory, then there are a group of people claim as if it is a violation of their right. I would say that we should have done that mandatory. Then this chapter also provides an account of policies, legislation, and international initiatives designed to improve the environmental management. The agenda is to give the support, legal support in managing the ecosystem, managing the environment. So that is where we can minimize the violation that happens. The most of the violations happens because of the greediness of the people. So now, for example, the latest legislation is on the removing the outdated vehicles. You all know that when the vehicles become too old, the emissions increases. So there are other burdens to the nature. So that's where the government has come up with a now you cannot use that. But there are some people who might criticize that, saying that this one has been violated. But if you look at from environmental angle and from the at the rural level, it is created and enforced by government agencies like the Central Pollution. We are also polluting the nature. For example, way back in 90s, the mid 90s, there are in Bangalore. I noticed that there are, because of the Ganeshas with the color paint were polluting the water, and also it was polluting the groundwater. Then I also noticed that 90% of our water bodies are fed with the sewage. Then I wrote an article highlighting why people, while practicing the religious practices, they are also punishing the god by dumping the god in the water body which are fed with the sewage. In fact, then subsequently I noticed that the things started changing in our system. There are school children who started preparing the environmental friendly Ganeshas like mud, etc., or even using the turmeric. They started doing it, and they, instead of taking Ganesha to the lake or a water body, they started they doing the Visarjana in the bucket. So that's how, when you bring the awareness in the public, probably things will start changing. Now, if you listen to the All India radio in the morning, if you are listening to the Karnataka, the local listen, every day morning there is a announcement how to follow the norms during the Ganesha festival. Similar thing happens during the Deepavali also. So that is where, the awakened society and people like us who are knowledgeable, we need to take part in the decision making. We need to equip the government so that we can minimize the environmental quality, violations in the system. So see, that is where when we are graduated, there is a responsibility on each one of us to make sure that the fellow citizens in our locality are not affected because of our actions. Okay. So these norms originate from local, national, or foreign government. So now issues addressed in the environmental policies is the air or water quality. We try to ensure the maintain the wholesomeness of air or water or environment. Then fossil fuel extraction, the energy conservation, habitat protection or restoration, then pesticide use. About 2 years back, there was a restriction on endosulfan. The moment the government realized that endosulfan is creating the deformation in the human and is leading to a lot of health issues at the local level. Children are having a problem. Then the government, state government and the central government came up with the restrictions. So that's where when you need to understand what is the causal factor, what is the effect. When you document it and give it to the government, probably the government will take the suggestion forward and then legislations will follow. In fact, that is what I have noticed whenever we have done the job. With the conclusive result, the governments have taken it up seriously. Irrespective of who rules the country, I have seen the success in our activities mainly because when we highlight that with the scientific principles. If you do the casual writing, probably the government may not be in a position to take up the thing. Latest one is the phosphate restriction in detergent is our intervention, wherein now there are restrictions on the phosphate used in the detergent. Okay. Then another most effective thing happened since 2000 is on the waste management. That is where recycling, reuse, etc. started happening. But there are still gaps in the implementation level. We need to break the nexus of the contractor and the engineers, so to remove these anomalies in the system. That is where, the people like us need to question the system when there are violations in the norms. Had the norms are not there, you wouldn't have been equipped to question the system. Now, today you can file a PIL against the loopholes in the system. For example, one of the youngsters in Bangalore, the student in Bangalore University went to the court. She filed a PIL about the highlighting the way the solid waste is being littered in the city roads. Because of her PIL, there was a discussion in the High Court. The High Court asked the BBMP, the local municipality, to come up with what are the mitigation measures they have taken and what are the norms that are there. Of course, BBMP claimed that they are doing an excellent job. There are no littering on the city. Then the judge has to tell the BBMP that next to his house there is a vacant land where he can see large dumps of solid waste being dumped there. Then he asked the municipality to get the study done through the IISC, and that's how the BBMP landed in our lab, and we carried out a study and we reported there are, apart from the government identified disposal sites, 9 sites, there are about 300 plus locations where unauthorized dumping is happening. Unauthorized dumping means it is not that the people like who throw the solid waste in the neighbor's compound or on the roadside. These are the locations where the waste resides for at least a week and which are the size greater than 5 feet by 5 feet. That's where we identified 300 locations. Then, of course, the court asked that is where we saw the action started happening in the region. And of course, unless the citizens take part in this kind of action, there won't be any solution. Sitting in front of the television every day evening, the criticizing the system won't solve the problem. What we need to come up with is we need to come up with a solution and highlight the causal factor and come with a solution that will help in the coming out with the appropriate norms to manage the environment. Then the another issue talked about is the endangered species trafficking. So Okay, now let me introduce you to the environmental policies. As I said earlier, policies are enacted as laws by governing bodies or they may be created and enforced by government agencies. An environmental policy is any policy that affects the environment. The environmental policies may originate with the state, local, national, or foreign government and address a host of issues concerning the air, water, disposal of waste, energy, poaching, etc. Then, environmental policy is an interdisciplinary topic and draws together technology, economics, natural, and social sciences. That means the people who work in the environmental sector will also have to know the multidisciplinary knowledge. They need to have the research. Say, when we go and talk to about the water pollution, you need to know the chemistry of the water, then also the hydrological regime, etc. In order to develop sustainable policies, it is in fact necessary to have some knowledge of the actual and potential environmental impact of certain activities and some knowledge of the technical characteristics, economic cost, social acceptability, and possible side effects of alternate policy options. See, when you come up with a solution, you will also look at what are the likely impacts because of your intervention. Okay, whether it has helped. See, in terms of economics, in terms of the environmental parameter, you will do the assessment. The quality of environment has both direct and an indirect effect on the standard of living. See, if the quality of the environment is poor in a region, you will end up paying higher price for that in terms of health. For example, if the air quality is poor, then there are higher instances of bronchitis and asthma diseases in the region. You see that some pockets in Bangalore, we have higher instances of asthma and bronchitis because of the air pollution, the vehicular traffic, etc. So that is where, if we ignore the quality of environment, we and our children will end up paying the higher price. In fact, I had seen some of the families where people dying at 40 or 50 because of the respiratory ailment. And also during COVID, especially the people with respiratory ailment are the ones who died. If you look at the people who died are mainly because of pneumonia in most of the COVID cases. The environmental degradation is also the consequence of the priorities set by states in their economic policies. To increase the GDP of a region, if you allow the industries to pollute, then naturally the common man have to pay the price. You would have got a higher money in the GDP, but the expenses on the health sector by the common man will be much higher than what the state would have got out of the GDP. This is what we need to question the system. We need to do that quantification to show that what the nature does when it is in a good quality versus the nature contribution when it is the integrity is altered with the pollutant, etc. When you do such assessment, then you'll come up with this one saying that whether GDP is appropriate economic metric for a state or a country, or we need to have a different economic metric. See, now for the last 4 or 5 years, we have been arguing with the government that we need to come up with a GEP, gross ecosystem product, which will take into account the contribution done by the nature in the development of the nation or the region. So that is where we have been slightly successful. Now the government of India has also constituted a committee to look at this, the natural capital accounting, etc. Okay, these policies are aimed at stimulating production and tend to ignore its environmental consequences. The main objective of the policies or the legislation is to minimize the environmental consequences. That means the focus is on the society, focus is on the biotic part of the ecosystem to ensure that the health of the people are not affected, health of the biotic elements are not affected. See, even if other biotic elements are affected, naturally the humans pay the price. But you would have noticed when there are diseases with the animals, when people take the meat of those animals, naturally people also have to pay the price. So the economic policies may actually have more impact on the quality of the environment than those policies explicitly designed to protect the environment. Now, when you look at these economic policies, unfortunately, last 3 decades since 1990, with the globalization, we allowed the market force to play a prominent role in the country for such bad decision that was taken. Though the country would have got the 2 years, the money we spent on the COVID in a places where the economic prosperity is there, you see the higher amount is also spent on the health, whether it is Mumbai or a Bangalore or some of the towns in Kerala. Now let's look at the economics and environmental policy. Environmental policy involves the certain measures aimed at achieving a sound environment. So that means the purpose of these policies is to maintain the integrity of the environment. It is usually developed in the context of public policy based on economic theory, which focuses on the levels of cost and benefit associated with the implementation of environmental policy. See, when the legislations are they drafted, you will also see there would be a cost benefit analysis also. Implementation of the policy, what is the kind of the cost this one involved in terms of economic and also the benefit you will also quantify. Then you will do the benefit cost ratio. If it is reasonable, then you will go with the policies. Okay. It is certain that economic policies are degrading the environment. That's what we have been noticing in the country the last 3 decades. The benefits resulting from environmental policies are extremely difficult to assess. That is the thing, but slowly we have come out with our own the metrics to assess the benefit of the environmental policies. If strict standards are proposed and implemented by respective authorities, certain polluting sectors have to take measures which cannot be achieved without incurring extra costs. In fact, this is what I keep highlighting in most of the forums, that we should make the industries to incur the extra cost. So when the industries set up the treatment plants or minimize the pollutant getting into the air, we can ensure the health of the surrounding population, the people who reside in that locality. So that is where we need to make the industries accountable. If industries are not following the norms, we need to make the bureaucracy, the people who are in the regulatory agencies accountable. When we make them accountable, probably we can minimize the pollution happening in the system. Then polluting industries are often keen to highlight the likely cost to them of proposed environmental measures. This is what used to happen during the 90s and 2000. Because the country was looking for the economic prosperity. So that's where, when industries came up with the proposal, invariably they used to avoid having the treatment plants, giving the excuse that it would incur the extra expenditure. Unfortunately, lack of knowledge in the bureaucracy because of the likely consequences led to the introducing many industries in the system without proper the pollution mitigation measures. In consequence, the cost of environmental measures are often given more attention than the benefit resulting from the implementation of the policy. So now of late, we started highlighting this. So some of my students have worked on the benefits resulting from the implementation of policy, how the society get a benefit, otherwise how the environment suffers because of the allowing the pollution in the system. For example, if you look at in Bangalore, the lakes are polluted. The consequence of the lakes pollution, we also did the valuation of the ecosystem to highlight if the lake is in good shape, what are the kinds of benefit people get. When the lake is polluted, what is the kind of the goods and services the lakes provide. For example, the lake in Bangalore, Rachinhalli, we saw that when we quantified in terms of fish, fodder, etc., the worth of the lake is about 10,500 rupees per hectare per day. 10,500 rupees per hectare per day, which was benefiting the local fishermen, washerwomen, then the farmers in the availability of water, etc. But when there is another lake in the same locality, which is heavily polluted because of the distillery industry. When we did the quantification of the goods and services, we found that the worth of the goods, what people get is only 20 rupees per day per hectare. That is only in the form of some waste they were getting it. So that means the loss of 10,500 to 20 rupees. If you look at who are the people who are affected because of this, the lower goods and services from the ecosystem, it is the local people. Local people like fishermen, washerwomen, etc., who are dependent on the lake were deprived of their right to live because of the pollution. Now, if you look at who are the people who polluted it, the industries in the locality, because of their not implementing the environmental norm. Now, when you look at the cost associated with the not implementing a thing, it amounts to about 9,000 or 10,200 rupees. So, which is quite significant. Had the industry implemented the technology and treated the thing, that would have worked out lesser than this amount. So that is where we need to come out with this kind of cost benefit analysis to highlight the benefit given by the ecosystem. And also another study we did in Bangalore was on the Vartur Lake. Vartur and Balandur lakes were highly contaminated because of the sustained inflow of the untreated sewage and industrial effluent. When we did the study on the valuation of the services, we also looked at the negative services. Because the lake is polluted, the people have to spend at least 30,000 rupees per year on the medicine and repellent. This is the cost of the pollutant getting into the system. Each family is spending 30,000 to 40,000 per year on the repellent and the medicine, etc. Then you know that what is the cost of the ill health of the environment because of the inaction by the regulatory agencies or the irresponsible behavior of the industries. The implementation of the strict standards and regulation will cause a change in the definition of property right. See, when the ecosystem is in good shape, naturally, the property also have the higher value. That is where, the people would like to stay closer to the serene environment compared to the polluted environment. No one wants to stay near the waste dump. The cost of the properties are very less there. Whereas the one which are closer to the pristine environment, like the park, etc., there will be higher demand for the land. So that is where, even the property right that will change with the prevailing norms implemented in the region. Industries which have polluted rivers for many decades will be confronted with regulations which reduce their opportunity for using the river in that fashion. See, once there is a citizens who are awakened, who are sensible, who start into the taking part in the decision making, then you see that no one can pollute the system. The industries have taken us for a ride for the last 70 years. Now is the time for us to question their and see that pollution happens at they reduce or minimize. Now, if you look at when the EIA norms were drafted in the country, if you look at carefully the 96 notification and subsequent 2000 this one amendment, deliberately that one section of the industry had intervened in the norms and made sure that that sector not appear in the EIA. That is the famous textile sector because of these Ambani. Their the money power, the governments at that time were they became a slaves of this industry, and that's why they diluted the norms. Now, when you look at this dilution, it is not that the only one particular group of politicians are prone to this kind of dilution. Irrespective of the color, I see that there are dilution when we are in power. Tomorrow, if you become a chief minister of state, you are also prone to this kind of syndrome. So that is where, when you are knowledgeable, probably you will minimize that kind of dilution in the system. However, throughout the process of formulating regulation, polluting industries will try to influence the policies. I have given an example of how the Vimal industries were instrumental in keeping the textile sector out of the EIA. Okay. Now, of course, with these legislations, now each of the industries have their own policies. If you look at there's one of the progressive group in Bangalore is a Wipro. So, the conserve natural resources through reuse, recycle, reduce, prevent pollution through effective control measures, comply with all applicable legal and other requirements. Like this, they have drafted their policies. Now, you all know that we talked about the circular economy, reuse, recycle, etc. Probably if we manage that, if you may ensure circular returns, we are also reducing the burden on the system. Now let's look at the sector-wise, the economics and the environmental policy and agriculture. Then agriculture, virtually the entire food chain attracts huge direct or indirect subsidies at the cost of taxpayers and consumers. Now, if you look at the way the farming sector, free electricity and subsidy on fertilizer, etc., is also led to the overuse of those electricity or the fertilizer in that sector. The subsidies send farmers far more powerful signals than do the small grants usually provided for soil and water conservation. When you look at the grants allocated for whether the watershed conservation or the soil and water conservation, compared to that subsidy, some of the places the farmers have become very powerful. Some of the politicians are the if you look at their background, they also hold a huge land, and that is where they dictate terms to the government. That's what is happening today in the borders of the Punjab, etc. Encouraging farmers to occupy marginal land and to clear forest and woodland, make excessive use of pesticides and fertilizers, and waste underground and the surface waters in irrigation. For example, in Karnataka, the free electricity is given to the farmers. That means they need not pay on the unit, this one only the inflation charge or something like that. In the process, the farmers keep the pump sets on, thinking that more water, the more yield. But unfortunately, what has happened with that kind of a practice is that wastage of the water. That is the first thing. And also, second thing is when you apply more water on the land, because of stagnation of water, there's a phenomenon of salinization or alkalinization of the soil. Over a period of time, that soil become unproductive or a barren. So now one subsidy or one incentive given without much thinking, you see that how it has led to the havoc in the form of the land degradation, etc. Now another thing which I have noticed in Karnataka is, when farmers commit suicide, the previous years we had seen higher instances of farmers committing suicide. That is when the farmers commit suicide, 5 lakh rupees was given to the farmer's family, to make sure that farmers' families are not in trouble. But unfortunately, what we noticed is that even the normal deaths were converted into the suicide by in hands in glove with the local, administration and the police. So, in fact, in one of the cases, when we were traveling, when we were doing the field work, when we had reached that place, we came to know that one of the person who was in the mid 50s had passed away, and we came to know that he died because of the heart related problem. But when we were returning from that village, we noticed that that was converted into a suicide, and the police were doing the mahajar. Then we came to know that this was done only they had a plan to give the part of the thing to the police. About out of 5 lakh, 2 lakh they were willing to give it to the police. So that's where the corruption at all levels. When we bribe, we are also polluting the environment. That's what is happening in every front. When you violate the traffic norm and when you bribe the policeman, in a place where you have to pay 500 rupees, if you are bribing 200 rupees, naturally you are also polluting, and that's where you lack the integrity in the system. So now look at the environmental policy and forestry. The pressure on forests throughout the world vary greatly in both developed and developing countries. These pressures are reinforced by government policies. The logging and forestry industry attracts a variety of direct and indirect subsidies. The perverse incentives that encourage the over-harvesting of temperate as well as the tropical forest also mark the world trade in forest products. When you look at the forest cover in the country, today it's about 18 to 20%. What is the norm on this one? It is supposed to be 33%. Yesterday I highlighted why 33%. Unfortunately, even today I notice that forest lands are diverted for the various activities in the name of development. None of the citizens have raised a voice saying that forest cover already is less than 33%. How the land could be diverted for the other activities? Point number one. Second thing, if you look at Western Ghats, there's a large-scale deforestation and a monoculture plantation, rubber, etc. are happening, especially in places like Karnataka, Kerala, etc. Now, when you look at Western Ghats, because of the water availability with the perennial river source, Perennial means you get the water 12 months in a year, throughout the year. So because of that perennial river, the people get the water, and because of the water, there is a food security in the peninsular India. Now, this food security in the peninsular India is happening because of the Western Ghats, which constitutes only 5% of the India's geographical area. Similar to the Himalayas in the north, we have the Western Ghats supporting the livelihood of the people, the millions of people in the peninsular India. Now, it constitutes only the 5% of the entire geographical area of the country. Looking at the kind of the food and the water security, we should have protected the Western Ghats. But unfortunately, for the last 1 decade, we have been seeing that there are the dilution in the norms to allow the encroachers and in the name of the development. Now, when you look at the Western Ghats, we have identified the ecologically sensitive region. There were two committees. One was headed by Professor Madhav Gadgil, my colleague, and other one was the space person, Dr. Kasturi Rangan. None of the recommendation of these two committees were implemented. When I look at the people who are opposing this ecologically sensitive region in the sun, they are the encroachers. When you go to Kerala, the Idukki district, you see there is a land of encroachers. The people have encroached the forest land, converted into the rubber plantation. Now, these rubber plantations, now of course, the church in that local area also has supported the encroachers. So when the government or when the committee talked about ecologically sensitive region, even the bishop of the church come on the street against that the measures of ecologically sensitive region. Now, when you look at the ecologically sensitive region, I said that when you look at the Western Ghats in total, it constitutes only 5% of the geographical area, and out of the 5%, we have identified the 40% of the region as the ecologically sensitive region, which would amount to 2% of the India geographical area. We should have maintained the integrity of these forests because they provide the water to the dependent people. Unfortunately, because of the nexus of the encroachers and the politicians, we see large-scale degradation. Even today, it's happening. Of course, my group is working on mapping the ecologically sensitive regions in the region. We had given input to the Professor Gadgil committees when we completed our work in one district. Now that work is being replicated for the entire Western Ghats. Probably in another 2 or 3 months, we should be out with the report identifying at village level the ecologically sensitive regions. So with that kind of weapon, with you people, I am sure the government may have to take this idea forward. Okay, so now let us look at the transportation sector. In this sector, especially motor vehicles also benefit from policies that are ecologically perverse. So fuel taxes in many legal framework, for example, still fail to distinguish between the environmental effects of different types of fuels like petrol or diesel, leaded or unleaded. Of course, now there are restrictions on the petrol, and most of the cities and most part of the country are using unleaded fuel. So, introducing that norm was also the challenge. And now today we are able to do it. And of course, currently the government of India is also giving a lot of incentives for the biofuel. Biofuel or the fuel manufactured using the organic sources in the environment like algae or the agriculture residue or the horticulture residue. So slowly the biofuels in the form of biodiesel and the biopetrol and the ethanol is picking up in the country. And probably if you look at the recently with the COVID, the requirement of sanitizers was there was a lot of demand for the sanitizer. Ethanol was used as a sanitizer. Now, when you look at the Uttar Pradesh, because the Uttar Pradesh government gave incentive for manufacturing ethanol from the sugarcane residues, they manufacture the ethanol in a big way, and also they were exporting it to the other countries. Probably that is the only state during COVID made a big economic gain through these green measures. So that is how, when you look at the kind of residue that are available in the country, if we can convert it into ethanol or methanol, we are also solving the fuel problem in the country. That is where, incentive has to come for the sector. Unfortunately, the government is giving the incentive. I was in that the committee also, and there are many projects were cleared under that. So the tax and tariff structure and direct and indirect subsidies encourage heavier and more energy intensive vehicles and road freight as opposed to rail transport in many countries. At any point of time, rail transport works out cheaper and environmental friendly compared to the road transport. But if you look at the way the bus and the truck mafias are there in the region, they always try to avoid the implementation of the rail project. That's where you see that many places lack the rail connectivity in the country. In some countries, private vehicle expenses can be deducted from the taxable income. These are the ways, to mitigate the pollutant emerging out of the vehicular use. For example, if you look at Bangalore and Hyderabad, because of the poor public transport, Bangalore contributes 44% in the emission in the transportation sector, and Hyderabad contribute about 54% of the total emission in the transportation sector. Now, when you look at the who are the polluters in these cities, the 60 to 70% of the pollutant comes from the two-wheelers. And four-wheelers. There are great human beings are there in Bangalore. In an AC car, I have seen them driving alone from Rajaji Nagar to the Whitefield, traversing about 24-kilometer one way every day. There is a metro connectivity now, and with the metro connectivity, this kind of the misuse of private vehicle is coming down in the city. But that is where we need to enhance the public transport. That is where the government has to come up with the economically viable measures. Now let's look at the environmental policy on energy. The major obstacle
Professor, may
is the existing framework of incentives and energy exploration, development and consumption. These incentives underwrite the coal, oil and gas, ignore the cost of polluting air, land and water, favoring inefficiency and waste. See, when we look at the what kind of incentive to be given for the renewable energy sector are things. Of course, if you look at 2015 at the Paris conference, the Prime Minister Modi assured the globe that India will do the decarbonization, and we will undertake the projects to enhance the greenery in the system. These are the assurances given to the community and global leaders also. Now, if you look at the progress subsequently, the India has been successful as far as solar energy is concerned. We are emerging as a leader. Even if you look at in the country itself, the Karnataka is in the forefront as far as the solar energy harvesting is concerned. Similarly, there is a push on the biofuel sector also. Unfortunately, there is a part of the section of the government is still pushing the coal also. So we are trying to see how to minimize the coal in the usage in the country. As long as pollution problems are mainly national, there is a need for a strong national consensus. This is where economists have to join hands with the ecologists, understand the implication of the pervasive incentives, and come up with a viable mechanism. See, when we talk about the polluting industry, I have seen the billions to distort the market and consumer prices in ways that actively promote the acid rain and global warming. They have been spending only few millions on measures to promote energy efficiency. These are the gaps in the system. However, environmental problems are becoming increasingly international or global, complicating environmental policies considerably. Now, with the COVID happening throughout the globe, I see that there is some thinking that the pollution, some of the countries will start arguing that developed countries have already polluted because of their earlier action. They have become prosperous because of polluting, while the developing countries are yet to develop. That's why the pollution should be allowed in the developing countries. See, none of these thinkers or none of these leaders think about their children and the likely implication of the pollutant. There are various ways to mitigate the pollutant. There is no need for us to have the energy intensive part, but there are to achieve the same kind of the energy efficiency, we have the better options also. Provided there's a will, we can implement that in the system. And environmental policy, the development of a managed approach to environmental performance is driven by various factors, including the need to meet increasingly stricter environmental regulations. See, that's where we need to have the environmental legislations in place. And then pressure from stakeholders, example, shareholders, insurers, and investors. Now, sometime when you have to have the insurance, the insurance company insists for certain norms. So you have to comply with the norms to have the proper register. So these are the ways, the industries can implement the environmental norm. Then supply chain pressure from the consumers, the historically poor relations with the regulatory bodies and local communities. Now, when there is a pressure from the customer, if the customers stop using the products which are polluting the environment, naturally no industries will have the courage to manufacture such products. Okay, that is where we need to do it. And as highlighted yesterday, you see that there are labeling, the wrong way of labeling the product, organic this one, which may not be from the true organic source. But when I look at some of the societies, the communities, the cooperative societies at local level, where I work, there are cooperative societies who are manufacturing the organic products. They are also incentivizing the farmers who practice the organic farming, especially in the districts of the Western Ghats. I work in the districts like Uttar Kannada, then the Dakshin Kannada, Shimoga, etc. We see that there are some cooperative societies who have been successful in coming out with the organic the farming, and also the environmental friendly the product. For example, in Uttar Kannada, there is a society called Kadamba Cooperative Society. When you buy the product from them, it is genuine the organic product. Maybe there are some culprits sitting in Bangalore might be misusing the brand of the organic. But if you look at, there are efforts to put in some of these regions to make sure that people have healthy food. In addition to this basic need of controlling pollution, some companies have identified environmental management standards as an effective way of improving productivity through waste and resource minimization initiatives, and a mechanism for increasing sales as customers turn on to the environmentally safer products. See, now that is where, when we take up the discussion on LCA, Dr. Saranya will highlight about the advantages of life cycle assessment of products, how the visibility of the product get enhanced in the market because of the certification. That is where awakened society, awakened customers certainly will put a pressure on the industries to minimize the production of the polluting products. So that is where, there are some awareness have happened in some part of the country, and there is still yet some more have to happen. Now, when you sit at home, when you place an order through the Amazon or a reason, you might have found that it is too convenient for you to get the product. But at the same time, you should also keep in mind the amount of the waste you generate by doing that. And also, you're not sure whether the product is actually from the genuine this one. For example, I have seen one of my students getting the cloth through the Amazon. Then later we noticed that the shirt or a trouser was a used piece. This is how this kind of the network providers also they fool the customers. That's where one has to be careful on this. Okay, for example, by reducing the use of certain hazardous substances, several local organizations have achieved major improvements in their air emissions, so that they no longer need to satisfy the strict controls imposed on them by the Environmental Protection Act. So this has happened in USA and also in India, by implementing the minimum by the air emission, the minimization, the country also has benefited. As I keep telling it, when you allow the pollutant to get into the air, your own customers, your own employees who reside in the vicinity of the industry are the one get affected of their health. So when employees have the health effect, naturally the absenteeism will lead to the lower productivity in the industry. So that's why by improving the environmental quality, by mitigating the air emission, the industries also get a benefit of that in the long run. That's where when we do the analysis, we do the life cycle assessment, from cradle to grave, from the raw material to the thing, to highlight the advantages of implementing environmental friendly norms in an industry. So in addition, they have gained a better working environment for their employees and eliminated the difficult raw material storage hazards. Okay, these are the other advantages. And environmental management system is the part of the overall management system that includes organization structure, planning activities, responsibilities, practices, procedures, processes, and resources for developing, implementing, achieving, reviewing, and maintaining the environmental policies. Now, when you implement, when you do the auditing in industry, when you get ISO certified, that means you have followed certain norms as far as the environment is concerned. When you they advertise saying that you are ISO certified company or a ISO certified organization, naturally the customers will also keep in mind that you have followed the protocol of the environment. That visibility in the competitive market will also we have an edge in terms of the sales, etc. An EMS aims to help organizations achieve sound environmental performance by identifying key activities which impact already or potentially on the environment, and by polluting in place the management control by putting in place the management control to ensure that the organization continue to meet its legal and policy requirements to deal with this impact. See, when you talk about environmental management system, you are making sure that you comply with the norm, and also you have your own policy to minimize the pollutant or the emission that happens within the system. So that means in the process, you will have a better product. Like I gave an example of the electricity, the consumption getting reduced by incentivizing the workers so that, the workers started winding the two motors in place of 1.5 or one motor in a day. So in the process, the industry got additional revenue also because of the improved performance of the employees. So these are the ways one can have intelligently manage the system so that we can also minimize the environmental burden. Now let's look at the agriculture and environmental policy. Agriculture has a major impact on the environment, especially on land, water, and biodiversity. When we use fertilizer or a pesticide, because of the subsidy, there is the higher amount of fertilizer being applied in the system. But if you look at the fertilizer used in the country, in 2014 or 15, we noticed that there is a large scale wastage of the fertilizer, and also the fertilizer, the urea is being misused by some of the industries for various other, for food adulteration, etc. So then when we alerted the government, the minister who was in charge of the chemical, the industry, then he came up with the implementation suggestion where, the neem coated urea was introduced in the country for the first time. By coating the neem, keeping aside about 15% of the total urea production, 85% was neem coated. That is what, when it is given to the farmers had an advantage of the pesticide pest control because of the neem inclusion in the urea, and also the food adulteration and the use of wastage of the urea for other purposes has come to an end. That is where the progressive looking the ministers, they will help. At that time, Mr. Anand Kumar, who was an MP from Bangalore, who had taken our suggestion and implemented that neem coated urea. Even today, you see that neem coated urea is there. See, earlier, if you see during 2000 to 2014, the chief ministers used to go to Delhi to plead with the central government to get the fertilizer. But after introducing the neem coated urea, we didn't see any shortage of the urea in the country. Sometimes when you come up with the environmental friendly measures like neem coated urea, you are also minimizing the conflict in the system. Sometimes the decision makers want to have the conflict so that the visibility for them is higher in the system. But by minimizing the conflict, everyone gets the benefit, as I highlighted in the case of the neem coated urea. So over the last 10 to 15 years, the environmental performance of agriculture has been mixed. Nitrogen and pesticide loading in water remain relatively high, and risk of soil erosion and water resource depletion persist in many regions and countries. Use of fertilizers, of course, has led to the nitrate contamination in the groundwater. That is where you see that and of course, some of the states have come up with the mitigation measures also. In recent years, there has been improvement in wildlife habitat, landscape, and the sinks for greenhouse gases provided by agriculture. But the most significant progress has occurred where environmental pressure have been greater. So that is where, when you are environmentally literate, you will certainly understand the concept that is involved in mitigating the pollutant, and you will push the government to take up the appropriate mitigative measures. The main environmental impacts of agriculture may be characterized through the beneficial or harmful contribution of agriculture activities to biodiversity, then soil quality, land quality, water quality. These are all linked. See, when you practice the farming, if you use too much of pesticide, you are also killing the biodiversity in the system. For example, by having the biodiversity, this is what the agriculture scientists and agriculture practitioners need to understand. If you follow the integrated the farming system, probably you are addressing the pest control also. For example, when you buy a tomato, if you understand the implication of things, so whatever the food we were taking earlier, our elders used to give, probably that is the most environmentally friendly as well as the healthy, the food compared to the junk food what the current generation takes in the at home or in the family. When we look at the biodiversity of the farming land, if you maintain the biodiversity, if the birds visit your farm, you should be happy because the birds will be taking away the insects from the thing which are acting as a pest on your crop. So that is where you should allow the birds to visit your farm, your agriculture field, so that you can minimize the insect this one. We did a kind of a study to find out how the farmers are benefited when he do might have got the bumper crop on 1 year, but the subsequent year they would have got the lower yield also. Then another serious thing is using those pesticide or the thing is the soil quality deterioration. The soil is if you need to understand, the soil is has a life. There are microorganisms in the soil. When we use too much of pesticide, we are hurting the microbial diversity in the soil. When the microbial diversity in the soil gets hurt, that for example, to transfer the nitrogen from the soil to the plant, you need the fungi. Now, when the fungi is not there, that microorganism is not there in the or a bacteria, when it is not there in the soil because of the pesticide, naturally your production comes down. So, the products will not have the nutrients. Similarly, it also affects the land quality and also the water quality. See, when there is a rain, when the soil gets eroded and move towards the water body, naturally you see that it also carries the pesticide. So the pesticide and other nutrient into the system. That is where when you take the fish from the river, naturally you are also eating the fish with the heavy metal. The pesticide contains the heavy metal. So that's where we'll pay the price for that. Whether you are a vegetarian or non-vegetarian, pollution hurts everyone in the same way. Then the water quantity, irrigation consumption, use efficiency, water retention capacity, flood prevention. Then air quality, emission of dust, odor, ammonia, and greenhouse gas. Then wildlife and semi-natural habitat. The diversity of animal and plant habitat associated with farming. Then rural landscape, environmental features of area shaped by farming. These are all associated with the farming sector. Now, when you use the pesticide or when you spray, naturally the air quality also has the problem. In fact, sometimes when we see in the farming where the pesticide is used, we also see that farmers having the more of the lung or the diseases. Okay. Then role of agro-environmental policies. Now, if you want to minimize that, you need to have the policies when private and public mechanisms designed to facilitate the improvement and diffusion of the appropriate farming practices and our market process are not enough to ensure the supply to meet the demand of environmental services. Specific agriculture environmental measures at the farm levels are needed and even at the national level. See, when you look at the country, for example, in way back in 2015, there was a crisis for pulses in the country. The pulses in the form of turral and all, the prices went up. So that is where, the government has to import that and you ended up paying 200 rupees or 240 rupees per kg. That is the time we suggested the government to have the incentive for growing the pulses in the country. Now, subsequent year, if you look at 2018, there was a bumper crop and the government didn't import the thing. See, and also 2016 was celebrated as year of pulses. At that time, one of the central ministers came to our conference. I for the last since 1998. My group is doing it since 1998. 12th event we organized in the last December. Next event is during the next December 2022. Every even year we do it. 2016, the symposium, one of the central ministers came for our symposium. At that time, we highlighted the requirement to allow the more and more pulse crop growing in the country. And then he took our suggestion to the government. And if you recall, even the earlier external minister, Madam Sushma Swaraj, came on the television. She also made a remark saying that because of the incentive to the growing pulses in the country, the pulse import has come down and they started exporting it to the other countries. Now, when you look at the pulses as a crop, it requires a less water. For example, to grow a kg of pulses, you need only 200 liters of water. Whereas to grow cereals like rice and wheat, you need 3,000 to 5,000 liters of water. To grow sugarcane, you need about 10 to 12,000 liters per kg of sugar. That means when you grow sugar cane and manufacture sugar and export it to other countries, you are not only exporting sugar, you are also exporting water. So that's where we need to be careful. And second thing is, not only the water conservation happens by growing pulses, it also minimizes the human-animal conflict. That is mainly because this pulse crop is not eaten by the wild animal. That's where the wild animal which comes to the villages, they have a particular path in in a year in search of food and water. They move from one place to other place in a particular path. In those villages, if we cultivate the pulses, then this pulse crop is not liked by the wild animals. So that's how we can also minimize the human-animal conflict. And more importantly, when you take pulses in your daily diet, you also have other additional benefits. We have seen that pulses helps in reducing the obesity. Our study also shows that when you eat more and more pulses, your body does not store more lipids. That's what is required. When you do the blood test, you also see that how much lipid is there in the liver, how much lipid is there in the other constituents. So that way that you can reduce the lipid accumulation or the fat accumulation or the obesity, you can bring it down. So then the second thing is it helps in the optimal brain functioning. The third thing is it also reduces the instances of cancer and the diabetes and the blood pressures also. Now, for example, one of my colleagues who was the director of this place, so he had a problem of blood pressure and sugar. So when he was in the position of that is called occupational hazard. But after retirement, he changed his food habits. Now, when you look at his food plate, he has 5 varieties of vegetable, 5 varieties of fruit, and a bowl of pulses. Now he is about 74 years, and he doesn't have either the problem of the diabetes or the blood pressure. Now, when you look at his plate, he has 5 varieties of vegetable, 5 varieties of fruit for about each of 50 grams. When you look at the variety, that also indicates diversity. When you have diversity in your food plate, it ensures the health in your body. And also the pulses gives the stability in the system. That is where, when you have environmental friendly food, you are also having a health in the system. That is what one has to keep in mind. And when you practice that, for growing pulses, you require less water and also minimal fertilizer, etc. Okay. And now with the changes in climate, probably the country has to move towards growing the resilient crops like millet, pulses in the country in the large way. Otherwise, we will not have water and we will end up with the poverty. So now such measures may be necessary to reduce the environmental harm or enhance the environmental benefits of farming activities. Now, of course, there are many advertisements you would have seen, the environmental friendly millets, etc. Millet itself is environmental friendly. I do not know why they brand it as environmental friendly millet. Okay, when designing and implementing such policy measures, number of general policy principles should be taken into account in the choice of the type of the policy incentive or disincentive in the form of payment of tax. See, the tax is a way to discourage the people to waste the resources. Okay, so that's where the polluter pays principle is. With the Water Act, we introduced that. Sorry, Air Act, we introduced that polluter pays principle applies to reducing the environmental harm for which farmers, as any other polluter, should be accountable. That is what we have been telling the government so that it will discourage the polluting the water bodies, etc. But unfortunately, none of the government is courageous enough to introduce that in the farming sector. However, the polluter pays principle guiding principles recognize the possibility of different property rights and reference levels among countries, with the possibility of offering transitional financial incentive to encourage farmers to adopt appropriate production practices for improving their environmental performance through reducing the environmental harm. So when you implement PPP, certainly you are also improving the environmental condition. It includes the case of transition financial assistance provided to stimulate the development of new pollution control technologies and abatement equipment to achieve a better environmental performance through improved production practices. See, when you are forced to have the environmental norm implementation through PPP, you will start thinking about the technologies and you will start thinking of environmental friendly things. Suppose if you are using the refrigerator, which is not energy incentive, but if you come up with a kind of a mechanism where you are penalized for using the energy inefficient refrigerator, then you will start thinking of 5-star the refrigerator, etc. Okay. Now let's look at the ecosystem conservation and environmental policy. The objective of ecosystem conservation and management as stipulated in the forest policy is to ensure the ecosystem stability through conservation of forest diversity, water catchment, and soil fertility. All these are linked to the human health. When you maintain the diversity in the forest, you will get a diverse food, and because of diverse food, you will have the better immunity. Because they have the medicinal properties, you will have the immunity. That's what I highlighted in my first lecture. In a region where the forests are of native species with a diverse variety of food availability, the villagers in those the vicinity of forest didn't have the higher instances of the COVID. Okay, the forest biodiversity is faced with the problem of encroachment, shifting cultivation, wildfires, lack of systematic forest management, and inadequate infrastructure and staff to prevent excessive resource use. That is where, when you look at the forest department, you see that there are people in a higher position in large number, whereas we do not have a foot soldier. Forest guards and the range forest officers form the important component of the forest management, because they are the ground soldiers. But we have a very few people in that the category, whereas we have more and more the people who sit in a air conditioned room come with all kinds of funny ideas, who sit in a Bangalore and they do all the mischief. So that is where, we had suggested to the government of Karnataka to enhance the staff at a lower level. So the government of Karnataka had a Western Ghat task force to manage the forest in Karnataka. I was a member of the task force at the time. Some of the suggestions given were implemented, and today in some of the forest divisions we have the good number of staff. That is where we could address some of the encroachment and other mismanagement at the local level. Then watershed management and soil conservation face a similar problem as biodiversity conservation due to increase in population pressure and inefficient forest management and production in watershed area. And of course, now the current governments are not very keen on the watershed management. There is a problem with that. We are trying to see how to improve the situation. Okay. So I talked about watershed yesterday, and also I highlighted by maintaining the integrity of watershed, how we will have water throughout the year, and because of the water availability, how the farmers are benefited. To repeat what I said yesterday, we did a comparative assessment of the villages, the farmers in the villages who are in the vicinity of the forest with a native species versus the farmers who are in the vicinity of monoculture plantation like rubber, acacia, etc. We found that farmers who are in the vicinity of native forest, if they are earning 1,54,000 per acre per year, the farmers in the vicinity of the monoculture plantation like rubber, etc., they were earning only 32,000 rupees per acre per year. When you do a detailed study, you are surprised to see that's mainly because the farmers who are in the vicinity of native forest, they could grow multiple crops, 3 crops a year are a cash crop. That's where they have the higher earning in the form of 1,54,000 compared to 32,000 rupees per acre per year. And more importantly, the farmers in the vicinity of forest, they could grow multiple crops in a year. That is because of the water availability. The farmers who are in the vicinity of the forest of native species, they could get the water throughout the year. their streams and wells had a water all the 12 months, so they could grow the 12 months the crop. Whereas the farmers in the vicinity of monoculture plantation or degraded landscape had a water for only 4 to 6 months. That's why there was a scarcity of water led to only one crop. Another important aspect we noticed is that, in the vicinity of native forest, we saw a higher number of pollinators. Because of the higher diversity of pollinators and also the number of pollinators, the productivity of the crop was much higher compared to the farming done in the vicinity of monoculture plantation. We saw only few pollinators and lower yield for the same crop like paddy, etc. So that means if you are talking about enhancing the livelihood of the farmer, I would say that you should also incentivize the farmers through the watershed development and make sure that diversity in the ecosystem landscape is maintained so that farmers get water and also farmers get the pollinators so that they have the higher pollination and better yield. Okay. Poor management and production have resulted into the deterioration of the watershed area, causing watershed shortages. That is what happening throughout the country today. Then planting of inappropriate species in watershed areas, illegal logging and inappropriate logging methods have further reduced the quantity and quality of water and are the cause for peak flood, droughts, and sedimentation in rivers. See, when you replace the landscape with the native species with the monoculture plantation, it's an inappropriate cropping. That is where the water retention capability comes down. That's where when you look at the flooding, what happened in Kodagu or in Kerala, it has happened in a landscape where people have converted native forest into monoculture plantation of coffee or any other crop. So then erosion due to cultivation in the river, on the riverbank outside forest reserves is also a major concern in watershed management. See, understanding this importance, you must have seen Rally for River or Kaveri College. The gentleman came up with this one on planting the species, the trees around the river coastal. That would help in remediation, treatment of water. At the same time, it also enhances the water retention capability in the sun. Of course, when this idea was mooted, that organization met with a stiff criticism from some of the experts and some of the farmers. Then, of course, this organization, the Isha Foundation, they saw my publication where I have highlighted the linkages between the water and the kind of the forest. Then they asked me to give an interview. When I talked to them, of course, my video is also available in the Rally for River website also. I'm not a follower of that organization. My only policy is to take the science to any level. So then, of course, when we had a detailed discussion, they had told me that they want to do it throughout the country. Then I suggested to them that they should take it up at the pilot scale as the Kaveri River and show the success of that Kaveri River to the country. Then automatically the people would replicate. And of course, there are large amount of resources they have got, but the progress is still very small. And therefore, yesterday, the government of Karnataka also released the app on Kaveri College. I hope that actually they will implement it in a quick period than being a paper tigers in the social network. Okay. Then encroachment, wildfire, illegal logging, and poaching are also the major factors contributing to the deterioration of wildlife population in natural forests. Inadequacy of baseline data on type of wildlife species and their habitat, and the lack of inappropriate wildlife management in forest management plan are the major reasons hampering the wildlife conservation and forest reserve. See, when I look at the wildlife management in most of the forest, the plan, it is only a reactionary approach. When the local inhabitants complain about the wildlife attack, then they come up with some allocation for the compensating those people who are affected. But before that, we need to understand why that conflict happened between the human and animal. Had we understood, then we could have given a long sustainable solution than having the ad hoc measures. Okay. See, that is where the data will play an important role. Yesterday also, when we talked about EIA, I emphasized on baseline data. Having data of that region will help in planning and coming out with the appropriate mitigation measures also. Also, coordination among the government institutions involved in wildlife and forest management are very poor. So in order to minimize damage to the ecosystem due to human activities, The forest policy stipulates to carry out EIA before implementing developmental projects which convert forest land to other land uses such as forest-based industry, mining, road construction, agriculture, dam settlement, shrimp farming, and tourism, etc. So yesterday we discussed about the how to do the EIA also. The scope and guidelines of the environmental impact assessment were for all the was prepared in consultation with the stakeholder. There was a deliberation also when it was the proposed in 96. There was a large scale discussion also. In order to achieve the ecosystem conservation and management in the areas of biodiversity, watershed management, and soil conservation and wildlife, we need to consider that the policy instrument. One sign of a sustainable economy is when the cost of the environment and health caused by economic growth have been added to consumer prices, and that economic policy instruments support the sustainable development. See, that is where yesterday I was emphasizing a natural capital accounting and valuation of the services provided by the ecosystem. When you know the worth of the ecosystem, like I gave an example of a lake in Bangalore, good state, had the worth of the services to an extent of 10,500 rupees per acre per hectare per day, compared to 20 rupees per hectare per day. Naturally, the industry which has polluted the lake have to be made accountable for reducing the services provided by that lake in terms of 20 rupees per hectare per day compared to 10,500 rupees per hectare per day. That is how when we start adding that, in the this one we also, in the prices, then you see that there are improvements in the environmental health of the region. The environmental policy should also supplement the economic instrument, so that slowly that will happen. The environmental policy instrument usually refers to the official action taken to curb and remove the negative environmental impact caused by the system. So when we have the policy instrument, that is where the legislations help. Then there is the need for the regulatory agencies to take action. Otherwise everyone will ask on what basis they have been penalized. So that is, then the court also will go by that. They will just quash that whatever that the action taken by the regulatory agency. That is where the legal instrument will equip the regulatory agencies to take appropriate measures on the violators of the environmental norm. So maybe at this stage, I will take a break now. Yeah, before I continue further, there was some question. Okay, can you ask the question?
Hello.
Yeah.
My question was that is there any existing awareness programs or something for the farmers so that they can be educated on what crops they should grow for diversity in crops and all?
So there are the various institutions have come up with the various programs. In fact, I have attended 2-3 places. I have given a talk also. That is happening at a regular interval. That way, I would say the Karnataka and probably to some extent Tamil Nadu, there is some progressive actions are happening on the ground also. If you go to
can farmers approach them? Do they know that they can approach them for better things?
No, farmers walk into my lab. Okay. The moment, see, today farmers are also, quite the net savvy, and, the qualified youngsters have taken up the farming. And for anything, they just send an email or they ask for the thing. So there are this one, of course, even the institution like GKVK, University of Agricultural Sciences, and the institution, the Social and Economic Change, IISC. There are various groups also which does this kind of capacity building program for farmers, including watershed treatment, watershed development, and what kind of the management one should have. This kind of programs are there. But that should happen throughout the country. If I go to the north, I don't see that kind of program. Okay. Okay, let us proceed further. The methods, laws, administration, and decision related to these actions are collectively termed environmental policy. Environmental policy instruments are divided into economic, information, and legal measures. Okay, economic is the incentives. The information is like smoking is injurious to health, that kind of announcement. Similarly, in the farming sector also it is there. Then legal measures. If the people don't listen, then they have to pay for it. Okay. Indicators of sustainable development frequently measure the status of development or pressures directed at it. The indicators of those who have seen the sustainable development goals, you will see appreciate that whether it's a water or energy sector or the land, there are indicators that are developed, which gives an idea about the status of the region as far as sustainable development is concerned. Indicators of environmental policy in the instruments reflect society's reaction, the steps taken to make sustainable development possible. So a number of different typologies may be used to classify environment policy instruments. One of the most commonly used distinction divides instruments into three categories. One is regulatory instruments that mandate specific behavior, market-based instruments that act as an incentive for a particular activity. Suppose if you are doing the biofuel blended this one, then there are incentives for that. Or electrical vehicle, there are incentives. This one, that is what the central minister announced. Then information-based instruments that seek to change behavior through the provision of information. Now these days, probably in the entire country, Karnataka may be better off because we have at the block level the soil quality, and I think that is there in the under the central government program also the soil health status. That gives an idea to the farmer how much the fertilizer he has to apply to the agriculture field. That information was earlier lacking, but today it's better off. Now all this data is available at the block level, and the data is available online. If you go to this one, and also the government has created the various portals like Raita Mitra, farmer friendly this one. There you get all the details about kind of the crop to be grown and what is the kind of the yield they are likely to get and all those things. So there are various measures are taken. We're taking into advantage the technological development, especially the internet, etc. Now let's look at the examples of policy instruments for cleanup production. National and local government must establish the formal cleanup production strategies or programs to act as a framework for the coordinated implementation of subsequent and more specific policy instruments. There are some of the things or like product ban, restricting the use of a particular product which are environmentally hazardous. As I gave an example of endosulfan, the pesticide which was used in the cashew plantations, they used to spray in the process. It used to get into the water and the air, and invariably the children and the farmers used to get affected with that. There used to be a deformity and also the mental problem. All those issues were there with that. Okay, now the government has put a ban on that. Then extended producer responsibility. That means probably that there are some industries have come up with that. For example, Motorola way back in 2000, they had introduced a system of buyback. When the industry buy back the product, they are also ensuring the recycling happening with whatever the earlier this was, so that they get some resources for the next to manufacture the next product. Second thing is they also are ensuring that their customers do not go for some other product. So that is the advantage of the extended producer responsibility, which essentially means that the manufacturer has the responsibility of maintaining the integrity of the environment. So during the use of the phase of the particular product. Okay. Then requiring cleaner production audits, that is where the environmental auditing has become mandatory in the industries, and mandatory EMS and reporting. I was mentioning yesterday also that industries have to get the certificate for continued operation. For that, they have to give the audit report at a regular interval, maybe once a year kind of a thing. For that, quarterly report has to be submitted, and then based on that, next year clearance is given. Then mandatory EMS and reporting, the environmental management system standards. Based on that, ISO certification, all those incentive mechanism has come up, which also has enhanced the visibility of the industry and the products in the market. Then, of course, financial and technical incentives also are the other ways of encouraging the penetration of the environmental friendly product in the system. The regulatory instrument, since the inception of the environmental policy, the predominant strategy for pollution control has generally been through the use of regulatory instruments. Usually a public authority sets standards and then inspects, monitors and enforces compliance of these standards, punishing a transgression with a formal legal sanction. Then this regulation may, for example, specify an environmental goal, such as the reduction of carbon dioxide emission by a specified date, or they may mandate the use of particular technology or process. Now, as per the recent the ratification of protocol, the government has committed to decarbonize. That means they will push for more of the renewable source of energy and bring down the emission in the other sector, the energy sector and transportation sector, and take up the afforestation of the degraded landscape, etc. Such an approach gives the regulatory maximum authority to control where and how resources will be allocated to achieve the environmental objectives, and it provides the regulator with a reasonable degree of predictability as to how much the pollution levels will be reduced. See, that's where when you do EIA, you also do some amount of the prediction. You have the baseline, the environmental condition information, and you will add the likely the changes in the pollution level because of your activity throughout the year. So then how you are mitigating that and how much you have reduced the pollutant, you will also address in the EIA report. Then we have specified and negotiated complaints. In a specified complaint, the precise and specific demands that have been imposed on the regulated communities with the little bargaining allowed and a few exceptions made. However, it has some significant drawbacks. The regulated communities tend to become alienated and united in opposition to the rule makers, and the approach has intended to encourage the use of end-of-life media-specific technology. For example, you know that when there was a boom of high-rise building in Bangalore, at that time I remember clearly that the builders had a commitment to the government saying that when they come up with the building activities in a region where there is no UGD, that means UGD means underground the drainage system and the sanitation system and the drinking water system, they will make an alternate arrangement, in the form of a sewage treatment plant and the drinking water supply to those the apartment which has come up in the outskirts of the city, which are beyond the city limits. But unfortunately, the builders constructed the thing, but without a sewage treatment plant, they handed it over to the occupants. Then they realized that occupants are kind of handicapped without a treatment system, and they were letting the sewage directly into the lake. Of course, we also pointed out which are the units have polluting the lakes and all the stuff. Then the National Green Tribunal made it a reason for all this the apartment unit to have the treatment plant by the specified date. Then we noticed that all these apartment the owners or the apartment the residents, they ganged up and there was there was a kind of association, the apartment owners association. They tried to resist the National Green Tribunal the stipulation of treatment at the source, and they want to continue the letting the sewage directly into the lake. At one end, Bangalore was talking about the lake being treated without pollution. At the other end, there was a section of the community were aggressively pushing the agenda of not having the treatment plant. Of course, I had a couple of meetings with these apartment owners, and they had invited me for the discussion. And I have been emphasizing that instead of resisting, they should come collectively and set up a treatment plant, which will also give employment to the environmental engineers and other youngsters. At the same time, they can show the model to the entire country through that decentralized approach. Hardly, see, when it comes to the implementation at the individual level, every human being is a greedy. He or she do not want to spend the sun, and they feel that the legal measure and approaching the court is a easier thing than solving the problem. Then, of course, I also talked to the BHARATHS. I said, instead of allowing these apartment people and resisting their resistance, it's better that BHARATHS have the treatment plant and allow that the sewage of the apartment let into the treatment plant, and let the apartment pay the higher amount for allowing that treatment to happen. So now the government is also thinking in that direction. So that is where it shows that, of course, even if there are norms are there, to implement the norm, the people think at the individual levels. Okay, the negotiated compliance approach, by contrast, adopts a more cooperative approach between the regulator and the regulated in setting and enforcing the standards. This shared responsibility between government and industry enhances the likelihood of a more open exchange of information between the parties and allows a greater flexibility regarding the means of meeting the standard. See, now, for example, if you look at the industrial the activities, the government also has set up a common effluent treatment plan. Common effluent treatment plant will treat the effluent that is generated by the industry in that industrial locality, and that reuse of that water could happen in the industry. So that is the shared responsibility. That is where, the kind of thinking has come. And in Karnataka, there are the common effluent treatment has come to the thing. But unfortunately, it has been outsourced to the private players who have not managed the thing. And in the process, still we continue to have the poor environmental standards in the industry sector. Moreover, a number of countries have started to develop regulation where attainment of certain targets like the recycling target is required, while concrete means of achieving such targets are left to the hands of the industry. That is non-prescriptive regulation. Of course, there are some of the industries who are progressive. They do implement. For example, if you look at Tata's, I see there is the implementation of the successfully the waste treatment, etc. Similarly, in the case of Infosys, where they have the green campus, where the waste is the liquid and solid waste is managed, the energy efficient devices are deployed in the campus. Okay, this in turn may increase the economic efficiency of the regulation and may be conducive to the adoption of the innovative and preventive approaches. With the growing appreciation of the limits of conventional policy instruments, many governments are encouraging the adoption of self-regulatory and co-regulatory policy instruments for promoting a cleaner production. Of course, this will work if there are sensible industries are there, if the sensible citizens are there. So by the self-regulatory mechanism, there are some industries doing a good job. It's instead of 100 industry, out of 100 industry, at least 40 or 50% of the industry seems to be following I have adopted the self-regulatory mechanism or a co-regulatory policy through the common effluent treatment plant, etc. But there are some rogue industries who still continue to pollute, and our natural resources are getting polluted because of those rogue industries. Okay, so then we have the market-based instruments. Broadly, market-based instruments seek to address the market failure of environmental externalities, either by incorporating the external cost of a firm's polluting activity into the firm's private cost, for example, through taxation, or by creating property rights and facilitating the establishment of a proxy market, that is by using a tradable pollution permit. So, for example, one of the way is to penalize the firm which pollutes. Then what does the industry do? They will put that money, whatever they have been penalized in their the product cost, and they enhance the product cost. That's how consumers end up paying for that. Other one is creating a property right and facilitating the establishment of proxy market. Having the tradable pollution permit. Suppose if you are polluting the water body to such extent, if you buy the tradable permit, so in other place where the energy efficient things are implemented or running the treatment plant, then you are permitted to allow for the pollutant to be discharged into the water body. Okay. Before introducing any new economic instrument, government should identify and evaluate any economic incentive that may already be in operation, either explicitly or implicitly. By and large, that kind of analysis it happens before introducing the economic instrument. The viability studies are done through some of the organization, and then only it gets into the norms of the region. Okay. This includes, for example, the use of subsidies to make the local industries more competitive. Many of these policies lead to artificially low prices for resources such as energy and water, as a result of which these resources may be overused, creating both pollution and shortages. See, when we give the subsidy or the lower prices for the natural resources, naturally it will lead to the over exploitation of the resources. As I gave an example in the case of farmers, having a free electricity will encourage the farmers to keep the pump set on. In the process, there is an overuse of the water, which leads to the land degradation and also wastage of the water. The government assessment of such policies are needed before other economic instruments are applied. Then we have taxes, charges, and fees. Taxes, fees, and charges may be used to promote cleaner production practices by raising the cost of unwanted outputs or by providing incentives to promote the energy efficient or the more efficient use of the natural resources. In some instances, it may be appropriate for the revenues from these instruments to be used to support cleaner production activity and thus to further stimulate the preventive approaches. Then a significant constraint against a more widespread adoption of the market-based instrument is it is often not politically feasible to set taxes at a sufficiently high level to achieve the desired environmental goals. So sometimes taxes are done at a minimal level. So that is to discourage the people to pollute the thing. But what is required to achieve the environmental goal is required. Okay. Then we have subsidies, financial subsidies in the form, for example, of a low interest loan, direct grants of or a preferential tax treatment can be targeted to specify industries to stimulate the technological development. You would have noticed this kind of approaches is adopted in the solar energy dissemination project, whether it is a hot water or for the electricity generation. It is important that government carefully examine the way that subsidies work to ensure that they do not create a perverse incentive for environmentally counterproductive behavior. So that means too much of subsidy, like fertilizer subsidy, you saw that there is a overuse of fertilizer leading to the other environmental consequences. Such things we should be careful when you implement. Or in the form of a grant or this one, in the renewable energy sector, it has acted as a catalyst in the wider dissemination of the technology. Then we have information-based the targets. In addition to creating an appropriate regulatory and financial framework for cleaner production, government may further stimulate the adoption of cleaner production practices through the use of information measures. There are sometimes advertisements in the television, whether it's a Urja program or the fuel efficient stove or the gas stove, free gases to the poor locality. This all helps in having the dissemination of the cleaner energy the devices. Similarly, the water efficient devices in the system. This may be used to provide the right incentive, for example, through the public disclosure of a firm's environmental performance, as well as to build capacity within industry. For example, through the publication, dissemination of relevant case studies. See, some of you would have noticed as a shareholder of the company, when you get the annual report, there would be a section on how the environmental aspects are dealt. What is the environmental performance of the company, etc. Okay. So now there are some example of the information-based strategies that is introduced by the government. You can read up in the book. Okay. Then now let's look at the environmental policies and programs in India. The year 1972 marks a watershed in the history of environmental management in India. Now, if you recall, we had an environmental conference at Stockholm in 1972. The Prime Minister Indira Gandhi gave a very powerful the presentation in that the conference, which also became a landmark statement for the environment in the environment sector. She said that poverty is the root cause of the environmental degradation. Because of the poverty, you see that there is a tendency to take advantage of the poverty, so that the influential section of the society was they're making the environmental degradation in the name of poverty. See, whenever we talk about the environmental degradation, even today you see that people say that the population increase is the root cause of the environmental degradation. That's where when the studies are done to highlight that it is not the population increase, it is the consumption behavior it is causing the environmental degradation. That is where the people who are well informed of this kind of thing should communicate to the government and to the local resident so that we can minimize the advantages that are taken by the vested section of the society. Okay. Prior to 1972, different federal ministries dealt with the environmental concerns such as sewage disposal, sanitation, public health, and in the absence of proper coordination system at the federal or the intergovernmental level. Okay. During the 24th UN Assembly of 1972, Pitambar Pant, the member of the Planning Commission, prepared 3 reports about India. With help of this report, the impact of the population explosion on the natural environment and the existing state of the environmental problems were also examined. The Planning Commission set up an expert committee to formulate a long-term sectoral policies, including the environment and the forest. It also noted that many environmental problems were continuing to cause the serious concern. For example, the loss of topsoil and vegetation cover, the degradation of forests, the continuing pollution by toxic substances, careless industrial and agriculture practices, and unplanned urban growth. See, all these topics have been dealt even before some of you are born. But even today, these are continues to be the same issue, and still there are, of course, there are some improvement, but still major part of the country we see these problems are prevalent. Okay, it acknowledged that environmental degradation was seriously threatening the economic and social progress of the country. See, that is where I highlighted how a farmer earning 1,54,000 rupees per acre per year compared to 32,000 rupees per acre per year for the environmental degradation. The person would have converted a forest into the rubber plantation in the name of development. That person would have got the economic boost, but at the cost of the farmers who live in the vicinity, whose productivity has come down and their earning come down to 32,000 rupees per acre per year in compared to 1,54,000 rupees per acre per year. That is where this kind of the field-based studies would help in alerting the government about the likely implications of the allowing the large-scale intervention at the local level. Now, the continuing decline of the quality of the environment, together with the tragedy at Bhopal, spurred the central government and a few state governments to adopt a stronger environmental policies to enact a fresh legislation and to create, reorganize, and expand administrative agencies. See, the Bhopal tragedy, what happened in the mid-80s, you see that we also came up with the the policy of the Environmental Protection Act of 1986. So that way, sometimes some calamities happen. That also has given idea for what kind of regulatory mechanism we need to have to mitigate that kind of the tragedy. Based on the recommendation of the Union government, in April 1990, the Government of India adopted a national conservation strategy and policy statement on environment and development. That is where you see that the conservation of the river or the lake and all those policies came up during the 90s. The preamble to the National Conservation Strategy adopts the policy of sustainable development and declares the government's commitment to reorient policies and action in unison with the environmental perspective. See, if you recall, in 1990s, we had the Earth Summit. That is where the Norwegian Prime Minister presented a document highlighting the concept of sustainable development. And that was also vetted by all the participating countries. There were about 194 countries. They have ratified that. So then it was taken into the respective the countries also. The National Conservation Strategy proceeds to recognize the enormous dimensions of the environmental problems facing India and declares a strategy for action in various spheres such as agriculture, forestry, industrial development, mining, and tourism. In February 1992, the Union government published its policy for the abatement of pollution. The statement declares the objective of the government to integrate the environmental consideration into decision making at all levels. To achieve that goal, the statement adopts a fundamental guiding principle: the prevention of pollution at source. See, instead of allowing pollutant to pollute the natural resources, it's better to handle the pollution at a source. This is the most effective way of address the pollution problem. The adoption of the best available technology. Of course, now we see there are some changes are happening. Especially the vehicular sector. You see the adoption of the latest technology, which are energy efficient and fuel efficient, and lower the pollutant. Then the third is the polluter pays principle. Then the public participation in a decision making. So the policies and legislation for environmental management in India has evolved over the years for the following needs, such as forest conservation for sustainable development and environmental protection for improvement and management of ambient quality of air, water, and soil. The forest conservation activities and the NGOs, which are instrumental in stalling and even checking many industrial projects which would have otherwise had the dangerous effect on the environment. That is where some of the restrictions have come, but still there are some gaps in the system. With the enhanced awareness in the system, probably we can minimize that kind of the gaps in the system. Now let us look at the forest conservation activities. The forest dwelling communities lived in symbiotically with a large number of wild animals, hunting some and venerating others. With the advancement of agriculture with the Iron Age, forests began their retreat to the hilly regions of Himalaya and to the lesser ranges, the central Indian plateau and the western and eastern Ghats. The practice of indigenous forest tribes and people of the northern and northeastern hills still demonstrate the close relationship that existed earlier between humans, forest, and other species. Even the act of cutting the branches of certain trees must be accompanied with a verbal or personally communicated apology to the secretary. The destruction of lost reserves of the natural forest has its roots in the British colonial policy towards the commercial exploitation of the thing. See, that's what I highlighted yesterday also. The day the colonial rulers got into the country, they didn't have the feeling towards our the land. You know, that is where looting started. See, when you feel for your country or when you feel for your village, when you feel for your state, then you will not get into the, over exploitation, etc. So that is where our started happening with the colonial rulers, and subsequently they created a bunch of bureaucrats who also have a similar mindset. So the people who aspire to become an IAS officer, if you ask them why they want to become IAS officer, their answer is not to serve the society, but they would say they want to make money. That is how we have generated a next bunch of youngsters whose agenda is to loot and make money than serving the nation. With the introduction of the Comprehensive Indian Forest Act in 1972, the colonial state radically redefined property rights, their proprietary rights, imposing on the forest a system of management and control whose priorities sharply conflicted with the earlier system of the local use and control. See, one of the things is with this kind of the norms, they also try to, the bureaucrats try to alienate the local people by preventing them to have access to the forest and have the resources. Minor forest produce, etc., were collected by the local people, which used to decide their livelihood. There was some restriction, and of course, now the village forest committees and joint forest committees have been constituted. This has been addressed to some extent. Okay. The clear felling of extensive natural forests and introduction of scientific management for their commercial exploitation marked an ecological, economic watershed in Indian forestry the history. So that means, the large tract of forest and introduction of scientific management for their commercial exploitation. This also helped to some extent the improvement in the forestry, but still that improvement is not up to the mark. Okay. The forest policy in the post-independence period can be categorized into three periods. The forest policies of 1952 emphasized the exploitation of forest primarily for producing valuable timber for industry and other vital purposes of national interest. See, and that is the time, during Nehru era, the forests were also converted into agriculture because there was the poverty of the food grain, which forced the government to encourage the people to encroach the forest, convert the forest into the agriculture and produce. Okay. But subsequently, the government should have taken a measure to stop that further encroachment. The National Commission on Agriculture 1976 drew up a second policy in favor of commercial viability of forests and production of wood for industrial purposes. The person who wrote this document, today he talks about the forest conservation. Okay. That's what happens as you age. Probably you will start thinking about the nature, and that is where the changes start happening in the system. These two policies led to the large reduction of natural forest cover. That means the Nehru period, allowing the forest, converting forest into agricultural land, and then the next is the, allowing the access to the forest by the forest-based industries also had led to the large-scale reduction of the natural forest cover. Today, we have only 18% forest cover in the country. Probably the Karnataka is slightly better. We have about 18.5%. But the situation is quite worrisome because we all need to understand that we need to have forest, we need to have water also for our livelihood. This was mainly due to the very low concessional rate charged to the industry for raw material. That is where subsidies given to the industry to boost the industries have led to the large scale degradation of the forest. For example, if you look at during independence, after independence, there were some MOUs with the industry. For example, for paper manufacturing in Karnataka, the patch of evergreen forest were given on lease for 100 years, where the industries can extract the bamboo. For 100 years, the cost of the bamboo is per ton is 1 rupee. This is even today that 1 or 2 rupees continues to be there, which has made the industry naturally to convert the forest into the other kinds of lands. Okay. The major negative effect was the non-regeneration of forests due to unsustainable commercial exploitation, denial of people legitimate rights to the forest products, and imbalance in ecologically sensitive regions, leading to landslide, soil erosion, and loss of biodiversity. If you look at the ecologically sensitive region, these are ecologically fragile regions or ecologically vulnerable regions. These are the regions which are undulating terrain. When there are vegetation cover, the vegetation would have given the binding effect. That means there would be no landslide or a mudslide in the region. But when we remove the forest, not only landslide, mudslide happens, even because all the water which falls in the region will run towards the ocean, there won't be infiltration. In that process, you will have the flooding happening in the region. That is what we noticed in Kerala as well as in Kodagu. If you see my writing in 2018 or 2017, we had predicted about the likely landslide and the flood in the region. Within a year, we saw that is happening in the region. So this is mainly because of the removal of the natural vegetation, which had provided binding effect to the soil, and also which has also allowed the water infiltration happening in the region. Then the large scale unsustainable commercial exploitation also often leads to the degradation of forest. For example, about 3 years back, one of the commercial outlets from Bangalore, they went to some of the Western Ghat district to collect the mango, the fruit. The mango, the one which is used for pickle. Their harvesting thing is to cut the branches, then plucking the mango from those trees. In the process, what happened? The farmers who had given those trees for them to harvest the thing, they didn't get the production for the next 2 or 3 years. They lost their livelihood also just because of this unsustainable exploitation of the thing by cutting the branches for the convenience of the person. In the process, farmers have to pay the price for their goods. So now let's look at how the NGOs have helped in the environmental protection in India. The urgency of industrial development in the urban areas often ignored the needs of environment and the small voices of the local community, which have drowned in the publicity of the large organization. There was an acute need for the local community to come together and for a non-governmental or governmental agency to represent these concerns. So several committed individuals came forth and formed a non-governmental organization to address the need. Some of the famous thing is Silent Valley struggle. That was also, there was a hydroelectric project was supposed to come up in a Silent Valley in Kerala. When it was the likely implication of that project on the endemic species of that region, which is a lion-tailed macaque in that region, when it was brought to the notice of the then Prime Minister, the Indira Gandhi, she immediately stopped the project when she understood that the environment is going to be degraded because of the hydroelectric project. She didn't allow that to happen. So we had such a sensible rulers earlier. Okay, then Chipko movement, hugging the tree to prevent the people cutting the tree. Then PIL for protection of Taj Mahal. See, this PIL also gave way to the formulation of the Environmental Protection Act of 1986. Now let's look at the laws and legislation pertaining to the environment. It is difficult to define precisely the boundaries of environmental law as we do in the case of law of contract. The traditional legal subjects like contract are well developed, whereas environmental law is still in its infancy. And of course, now it's slowly emerging as the more matured the mechanism. However, the attention is now increasingly focused on the rationalization and streamlining of existing measures rather than the development of a substantial law. And of course, in the latest thing, there is a move to even to nullify the environmental legislation, and some of the legislations have been made toothless also. In the general sense, environmental law means rules or regulations governing the human conduct which are likely to affect our environment. The accepted view of current definition of the environmental law is that which reflects the legislative measures, the administrative and judicial structures to protect the environment. Okay? So the environmental law thus helps in regulation of the resource use, protection of the environment and the biodiversity, mediation, conflict resolution and conciliation, then formulation of the stable, unambiguous undertaking and agreement. See, these are all help in the equitable share of natural resources and availability of resources in the long term. Then let us look at the international law. Before that, I want someone to summarize. One of you can summarize the international law governs the relations between states and has no direct effect on domestic law or individuals. See, we would have signed the international treaty. There is no binding on the respective country to implement those the norms. But by and large, most of the country tried to be a decent and they follow, they enact the respective laws in the national level or the federal level and implement it. Okay. So that means this cannot be forced on compliance to an understanding treaty. The UN conference of 1972, then Rio Summit 1992, Rio plus 10, these are the various international forums where there are major decisions were taken. Then some of the basic principles of the international environmental laws are polluter pays principle. See, when we talk about polluter pays principle, we enacted the Air and Water Act to bring it this one. Then the principle of non-discrimination. Across the country, you should not have discrimination saying develop, developing, and all those things. Then the third is a precautionary principle. If you are sure that particular product will have a hazardous this one, then there are restrictions on the use based on the precautionary principle. Principle of common differentiated responsibility. That is across the nation. The responsibilities are shared. That is what it means. Then principle of intergenerational equity. That means ensuring the continuity of the availability of resources to our children is the lesson. So that means even the children have the right to live on the earth. We should not use up the resources. That is what that principle. This all emerged at the international the forums in the various discussions. Whether it is a polluter pays principle or non-discrimination or precautionary principle or common differentiated responsibility. That is where the government argued as far as the implementation of Kyoto Protocol or the restriction on the certain activities by the countries. The government said that some of the countries have not they come up to the level what the developed countries have come, and they should be given the incentives to with the energy efficient devices or technologies so that these countries also can come up with the same kind of the development. That is what the differentiated responsibility. That means the onus is on the developed country to make the developing country also to become prosperous by extending the support in terms of the energy efficient technologies and incentives, etc. Even for the incentives for maintaining the forest, etc. If you look at one of the greatest thing that happened in the international forum when India participated, that is where knowledgeable persons taking part in international deliberation always helps. When the countries were talking about the carbon mitigation, the emission of carbon, the delegation which participated from India in that forum, they argued Indian forests have sequestered the carbon and also sequestering the carbon for having done this job. When carbon is sequestered, it is not just a carbon that is emitted in the India. It is a global carbon. So that's where there has to be incentive for the maintaining the forest or the afforestation activity. That is where UNFCCC is a United Nations Framework for Climate Change came up with that mechanism to compensate for that. That is where this kind of the knowledge will help us when we take up the professional career. Okay. Then these are some of the international institutions. UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program after the Stockholm Conference. Then we have the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, addressing the deforestation for the agriculture and fishery, etc. Then we have the WMO, World Meteorological Organization, alerting us about climate changes, etc. then International Atomic Energy Agency. So like that, we have various agencies. Okay. So then the key environmental treaties are International Water Courses, Helsinki, the marine pollution, the atmospheric pollution, hazardous waste, nuclear energy, then Convention of Biological Diversity, and the journey continues. Okay. So now what are the objectives and principles of the environmental legislation? The objective of the environmental legislation are to provide a set of enforceable and standard rules to contribute to the pursuit of preserving, protecting, and improving the quality of the environment, protecting the human health. When you do the first one, automatically natural resources in a prudent and rational way, promoting measures at the international level and to deal with the regional and or worldwide environmental problems. So now, for example, the recent COVID, the way the government shared the vaccine, etc., you will see that. Okay. Okay, then there are a set of standards such as achieving a high level of protection by taking into account the diversity of situation in the various regions. That is where, the region which are ecologically sensitive, if you identify, then to conserve or protect that, what are the kinds of measures that are required to give a legal basis to the precautionary principle whereby legislative action is taken where there is no reason to believe that substances introduced directly or indirectly into the environment may or are likely to create hazard to human health, harm living resources, damage immunities, or interfere with other legitimate uses. So that is where, based on the precautionary principle, some of the items were banned or restricted in the region. The environmental legislation is generally based on the principles that environmental damage should, as a priority, be rectified as source and that polluter pays for that. Okay, now with this, let us look at the kind of the strength the country has. See, if you look at the Constitution of India, Indian Constitution is perhaps one of the rare constitutions in the world which contain the specific provisions relating to the environmental protection. The Indian Constitution, Article 51C, provides that India shall respect the international treaty. See, though we say which is not binding, we ourselves said that we will follow the thing. So then Article 48A puts duty on the states regarding the protection of the environment. That is where the states, the federal, the ministries have the responsibility of protecting the environment. Then Article 253 of the Constitution provides for the powers of Parliament to make law or implementing any treaty. So that means the basis for implementing the law or making the law is given to the Parliament. So now these are some of the legislation what we see in India. We have Indian Penal Code 1960, the Criminal Procedure Code, then Bengal Smoke and Nuisance Act of 1905, then Indian Motor Vehicle Act, Indian Fisheries Act, Mines and Minerals Act, the Industry. See, with the problem cropping up, there are some regulatory measures also started through this kind of the laws. Then we have Forest Conservation Act, then Water Act of 1974, the Pollution Prevention Control of Pollution, then the Air Act of 1981, the Environmental Act of 1986, then National Environmental Appellate Authority Act of 1997, then we have the National Environmental Tribunal Act of 1995. So then if you look at the 42nd Amendment, which directive principles of state policy, so that the states are also empowered to take up the environmental measures. The Article 253 talks about the implementation of treaties. 1974 is the water legislation passed by the Parliament. Then we have that the other thing sector-wise, the Water Act of 1974. The water is a state subject. Parliament cannot legislate on water subject. The states have to agree for the Parliament legislation. Majority states the resolved for Parliament legislating. Parliament therefore passed the Act. Then when you look at that act, it prevents and controls the water pollution, maintain the wholesome of water, establish control of state boards for prevention and control of pollution, then empower the boards for prevention and control of pollution, provide penalties for the contravention of the provision of the act. If there are any violations, then the penalization aspect also, and to establish control or state water testing laboratory. That's where you see there are regional laboratories who are set up in various states to maintain to carry out regular water testing in the region. Then we have State Government Act. During 1950s and early 60s, several states have taken steps on water protection. The Orissa River Pollution Act of 1953, the Punjab State Tube Well Act of 1954. See, with the scarcity of water in the region, then the regulation came into existence. Okay, West Bengal Notification Number 7 regulation, Control of Water Pollution Act of 1957. Okay, then Jammu and Kashmir State Canal and Drainage Act of 1963. Then Maharashtra Water Pollution Prevention Act was passed in 1969. Then there are various the central government initiatives. Ministry of Health was started in 62. The bill on prevention of water pollution in 1969. Then it became the law in 1974. That is the Act of 1974. Then Department of Environment came up in 1985. Earlier it was part of the Ministry of Science and Technology. Then when the Rajiv Gandhi was Prime Minister, the ministry was constituted for Environment and Forest in 1985. Of course, today the minister who is in charge of Environment and Forest seems like the finance minister. Rather than thinking about conservation of forest, he thinks more about how to increase the GDP. Then establishment of Ministry of Forest and Environment, the Ganga Project Directorate. These are the various things that come under the ministry. 1981 Air Act was there. Then Environmental Act of 1986, the State and Pollution Control Board. Then the MOF has also decided to shift from concentration to the load-based standards. See, earlier they were allowing the pollution. Now, at source only they look at the load, and then the industry has to implement the mitigating measures at the source system. This would add to a polluter cost and remove the incentive to dilute the effluent by adding water and strengthen incentive for adoption of cleaner technologies. Now, implementation of this norm, load-based standards, would have started improving the environmental condition in most part of the country. But wherever regulatory agencies are weak, you see that the load-based standard didn't work. Issued water consumption standards, which were an additional charge for excessive water use. Then the targeted small-scale industry providing technical assistance and limited grant to promote the common, the effluent treatment plant or central effluent treatment plant. Then also concept of environmental clearance started way back in the mid-90s. Then we have the environmental impact assessment. Environmental management, the approach of humans to the utilization of resources is a problem of history rather than a new discovery. That is, our problem is overexploitation. Our greediness will lead to that problem. In this period, a combination of rapidly governing world population and technological progress have created a serious problem. Wildlife, with the technological progress, we started giving way for the more and more exploitation resources, led to the other problems. Okay. The history of environmental management in India, learn the impetus provided by non-governmental sector movement to formulation of policies and legislation, and describe the institutional framework for environmental management, the merging challenges and strategies which would guide the future policies and legislation for environmental management in India. So that's where we need to recall what Mahatma Gandhi talked about it. I'm sure you all know Gandhi. I'm talking about Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi of earlier period, not the Gandhis of today. See, Mahatma Gandhi talked about earth provides enough to satisfy every man's need, but not for every man, anybody's greed. That is where optimal or prudent use of the resources were talked about it. Okay, with this I am concluding the second chapter.